Senator Waters.
Thanks very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. As we began the 44th Parliament and as I listened to the Governor-General's address in reply, I reflected on the achievements of the last Parliament that I was so proud to be a part of. And I remember with great clarity that wonderful day when we passed our first carbon price laws in this Parliament. What a joy that day was, and I felt so proud as a Queenslander to be doing what was necessary and taking that first step towards what is necessary to safeguard our reef, to safeguard our beautiful farmland, our wonderful rainforests, and to safeguard our very coastal way of life. And as a mother, of course, to think about the effect that those sorts of decisions would have on future generations. That was one very high point, but of course we had others. The passage of the mining tax, albeit sadly a watered-down version, a really crucial step in this nation's history to try and share the wealth. Of course, the passage of our first universal dental care laws in Denticare to allow children finally to be able to get the dental care that they need, just like they would go to a doctor, they can now go to a dentist. And of course, finally, to get some protection for our farmland and our aquifers from coal seam gas exploration and mining, with the passage of a water trigger in our environmental laws. I reflected on all of those achievements and I felt very proud. But in listening to the Governor-General outline the agenda of this new government, frankly I was horrified. And I was horrified at the lack of long-term vision and at the selfishness and narrow-minded approach to policy making that was expressed by our gracious Governor-General in advocating and speaking the Abbott government's agenda. Now, of course, the first thing that struck me as incredibly sad and short-sighted and confronting was this obsession with repealing our carbon price. Now, not just that, but proposing to replace it with this amorphous, undefined concept that we hear in estimates and in Senate inquiries last week, not even stakeholders know the details of, this amorphous direct action plan, which no economist in the country has said will work, and certainly no ecologist or soil scientist, and which has a set amount of funding dedicated to it that our Prime Minister has now said he won't go above, even if this government is not on track to meet their 5% cut of greenhouse gas emissions. So we have a weak scheme which isn't even backed by its own proposers. And of course the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, that wonderful renewable energy bank that the Greens are so proud of being part of establishing, we hear last week, is actually making money for the taxpayer. It's investing money in renewable energy, not at a cost to the taxpayer, but at a profit, and it's bringing down emissions. So this marvellous carbon price legislation and mechanism, with all of its good features and all of its success, now on the chopping block and dismissed in a three-word slogan, axe the tax. Such tragic short-sightedness. And of course, the Governor-General continued on with the Abbott government's agenda of axing the mining tax. Now, we all acknowledge that it has its flaws and of course it needs to be much stronger and could and should be raising far more revenue. But rather than fixing those problems, this government proposes to get rid of it entirely. Of course, they're not proposing to reverse the cuts that single parents had to face when they were dropped down off their parenting payments onto Newstart. What a shame that some cuts are open to exploration and others are not. The other particularly painful aspect of the Governor-General's speech was the reference to securing our borders. Now, I felt a real chill down my spine as those words were read out. Securing our borders from what? From desperate people who are fleeing situations of danger that most Australians don't experience and probably will never experience in their lives, fleeing with their families, with their children, with their parents, with their siblings, just wanting to have a safe life and to contribute to a new nation where they can feel like their lives are not at risk and their children can prosper and flourish. Securing our borders from those people, is that really what it's come to? Are we that afraid of other human beings? I was horrified. Of course, we know the promise to retrench 12,000 public servants is going to hurt not only those families, but also will cut the services on which we all rely. And I thought it perfect irony that now the new commission of audit that's been proposed by this new government is headed up by none other than the head of the Business Council of Australia, the former head at least, Tony Shepherd. Of course, we know business reigns supreme under this new world order, and now they are in charge of the razor gang of this new government. Horrific, but somehow very fitting. We heard, of course, in this last week that even promises that had been made pre-election, which we had assumed would be maintained, are now going to be completely tossed out. The school funding promise, the Gonski funding promise that was made clearly by the Prime Minister, is now meaningless. Those words, apparently, we're told, don't mean what we thought they meant. The Prime Minister didn't actually mean what he actually said. So many backflips and so much short-sightedness and self-interest. The overall takeout from that speech that I sat with great sadness and heard was a real lack of positive vision, a fear about the people that we share this planet with, a disdain for the needs of the natural world, and this obsessive belt-tightening for no apparent good, in disregard for the real needs of families and workers and the services on which we all rely. Now, sadly, this is not an experience that's new to us in Queensland. We've now had a state government with a similar, very destructive agenda unleashed on our state for the last 18 months. We've already had almost 14,000 public servants sacked from their work. And as I've said, not just those families that suffer, but the services on which we all rely are now not there. They've been contracted. They've been dismissed. Sadly, on our environment protections, the Newman government has cut or repealed or watered down more than 15 of the protections that Queenslanders had become used to and had felt were necessary, protections for our free-flowing wild rivers, many of which occur on Indigenous land. And I met just last week with traditional owner in the Wenlock region, David Claudy, who said he doesn't want mines and dams on his land, and he wants to keep those protections for his land that were on our law books, but which Campbell Newman is going to repeal, and it's going to be open slather on the Cape once again. Our coastal protection laws, they're also gone now. So much for protection for our reef from the huge number of new and expanded coal and gas ports. And national parks, not so sacred after all, despite the fact that there's only 4% of them in the country, and about that as well in Queensland. Logging, it's fine. Grazing, yep, it's fine. All of that sacred land now open, and of course for massive tourism developments as well. Hotels, cows, logging do not belong in national parks. And other sneaky systematic reforms, like changing the court costs rules so that people in the community who want to challenge a decision on a development and want to have their say about the future of their region and their locale, they now can't afford to go to court, because now you have to pay in the Planning and Environment Court. These systemic changes to lock people out of our democracy. Now, sadly, we've seen even more of that in recent months from our state government with the changes to the rules about bikies. Now it seems that people aren't allowed to gather anymore and ride a motorbike. And of course the extent of those laws is what's truly scary, the fact that they could actually apply to any organisation of 3 or more people. That's horrific. We are back in the Joe days. Here we go again, as the phrase goes. Of course, the sentencing mandate that's been brought down, the fact that judges, well, they're not allowed to decide things like sentences anymore, even though they have for eons, and that's actually part of the doctrine of separation of powers. Never mind, Campbell Newman and his Attorney-General will dictate how long alleged criminals will go to jail for. And of course the Crime and Misconduct Commission, set up in Queensland after that wonderful inquiry by Tony Fitzgerald, now seemingly a political appointment made who is dictated to by the state government in what they can and can't say, and when that is investigated, that parliamentary committee gets sacked. There is absolutely no scrutiny or transparency. These people have a glass jaw, and they are intent, it seems, on removing all environmental protections and locking down and removing our civil liberties. It's very concerning being from Queensland. The attacks don't stop there. Of course, they're now going to change the electoral system to lock in their own power. We're going to lift the public funding threshold up to 10% to make sure that only the big parties can have a say in parliament and can retain their seats. And most importantly, they're going to lift the cap on political donations. So if you're rich enough, you can buy yourself a seat in parliament in Queensland now. And sadly, we all know what the influence of wealth does to politics, and we've seen that very recently in this very parliament, where Mr Clive Palmer, who's due to give his first speech today, spent between 12 and 20 million, we don't quite know because he hasn't told anybody yet, and has effectively bought himself representation in the parliament. He had a bit of an argument with Campbell Newman about a mine and a railway, didn't like the result, spent a whole lot of dough, and now he gets a voice in federal parliament.
Senator Waters, the clerk has reminded me that you should refer to Mr Newman as the Premier of Queensland by his appropriate title.
Thank you, Chair. Mr Deputy President, I'll do that in future. So, yes, Mr Clive Palmer here to ostensibly represent the people of Fairfax, but it remains to be seen whether it will be his interests or theirs that get the most currency in this place. It's such a disappointment that we've seen this complete lack of a positive agenda from the new government. And this is going to be a really challenging parliament, and it's going to be a challenging parliament not just for those of us in here who actually want a better future and a fairer society and protection for our planet, but it's going to be a challenge for people in the community who feel that same way. And I was particularly disappointed with the Abbott government's plan for a so-called one-stop shop for environmental protection. Well, the shop is selling out the environment, and it's letting the state premiers do that. Now, we've had 30 years of this country, of the federal government, gradually playing more of a role to protect the places and the species that are so significant that the world wants us to conserve them. Nationally and internationally significant places and species, they've become the responsibility of this parliament. But Greg Hunt, who's meant to represent the environment and is meant to look after it and caretake those places, well, he's decided that he doesn't really want that responsibility anymore. He'd rather just leave that up to state governments. State governments who, of course, have had an atrocious track record on environmental issues. The Franklin Dam is the best example. The Mary River Dam in Queensland is another example where the state was willing to sell out our environmental assets, and it took the federal government to step in and say, sorry, that is too precious to lose, that is of national significance, we won't let you destroy it for private profits. That is the system that's now under threat from this government, and they are sneaking through changes and entering into memorandums of understanding with all of the states, and there's of course a huge build-up to the COAG meeting next week where states are being heavied to take on these new responsibilities because Mr Greg Hunt doesn't want to do his job anymore as the Environment Minister. He doesn't want to have responsibility for protecting those precious places and species. He doesn't want the climate laws either, so I don't actually know what he does want to do in his role as Environment Minister. I think he's probably going to have a bit of free time on his hands if that's his approach. Now, of course, in Queensland, the reef is a massive employer for our economy. We've got 63,000 people who rely on the reef for their livelihood. That's an awful lot of people. It's far more than the mining industry's ever had. And yet we have plans for huge doubling and trebling of coal exports, which will, of course, drive climate change and drive direct destruction of the reef through the 6 new or expanded coal and gas ports that are on the books. Now, the World Heritage Committee has said, guys, you've got to stop this industrialisation or we're going to list the reef as World Heritage in danger. And you would hope and think that that might have some kind of effect and that the government of the day might take that warning seriously and do what's necessary to arrest that decline of our reef. But no, we've had no moratorium on these coal ports. We've got full steam ahead. We've got a strategic assessment that was released last week that doesn't actually stop any of those destructive developments that the World Heritage Committee was so concerned about. And we've got the Abbott Point decision due to be made by Greg Hunt, the Minister for the Environment, Mr Greg Hunt, the Minister for the Environment, next week. Now, that would become the world's largest coal port in Queensland, right when the climate scientists are saying we are seriously at the 11th hour. I don't want to see the reef that I enjoyed so much as a child devastated by the dredging and the dumping and the shipping highway that it would become if that Abbott Point coal port expansion goes ahead. And I don't want to be party to the climate effects that opening up the Galilee Basin for the profits of Mr Clive Palmer, Ms Gina Reinhart and a few Indian multinationals, that is not in our nation's interest. That is not in our grandchildren's interest. That is in the interest of making a few rich people even richer, to the detriment of all of us. I hope that the Minister for the Environment reconsiders what I suspect will be his approach on Abbott Point and thinks long and hard about his own children's future and the future of all of our children. Now, of course, much of those ports are proposed for gas export as well as coal, and we know that coal seam gas is dangerous to our aquifers. We know that the National Water Commission and the CSIRO have warned us about the potential long-term effects. We don't even know if we can mitigate those long-term effects. We could be contaminating or depleting aquifers that could never be repaired. That's what the science is saying. And yet we've seen open slather and approvals given left, right and centre by both the state and the federal government, with no regard to the precautionary principle that says if you're going to really bugger something up, maybe you should think twice about it before you give the approval. Never mind that. Just give the big tick to big business and to the big miners. And when you're in the bush, make a nice little promise to a landholder and then do absolutely nothing about it when you're back in Parliament. I was temporarily pleased with Prime Minister Abbott's remarks reported to Debbie Orr, one of the landholders in Tara in the Darling Downs, when apparently he said he did think landholders should have the right to say no to coal seam gas. And I agree, I think they should. It's a huge risk that they're taking with their land and their water and the climate. They should be able to say no. Sadly, when I moved a motion in this place recognising and applauding the Prime Minister for that statement, members of his party, the government here in this chamber, chose to vote against that motion. And sadly, so did members of the Labor Party as well. We see one thing being said in the bush to communities and the absolute opposite being done in this chamber, and I hope people realise that they are being sold a pup. I want to finish off by mentioning women. As one of the youngest women in this parliament, and given the huge issues that women are still facing in this day and age, the lack of equal pay, and not just for work of equal value, but actually for the same job. There were some horrifying statistics about how female dentists are earning less than their male counterparts when they've had exactly the same training and experience. Now, the fact that that's still happening in this day and age just blows me away, and we have got to fix that. So the lack of equal pay for the same work, for work of equal value, of course women's reproductive rights, which I imagine the next Senate will probably have to confront, given the proclivities of some of our colleagues in this place, the discrepancy in superannuation that women find at the end of their working lives, and the fact that so many Australian women still face violence in their daily lives. These are crucial issues that we must make some headway on. And yet we have one woman in Cabinet, just one. Out of 20 people, all they could find was one woman. Now, there are some good, strong women on the Liberal side. Naturally, I disagree with their policy stance, but they are some good, strong advocates. They were overlooked, and now we have that dearth of women and that perspective in Cabinet, and I'm worried that it will really show. I'm proud to now be the spokesperson for women for the Australian Greens, and I'll be building on the record of my colleague, Senator Rhiannon, and I hope and expect to get support from women in all parties to try and further this crucial equity issue. This 44th Parliament is going to be a bit of a tough time for us in here who want a better world and who want fairness and equity and a safe environment for our kids, and it's going to be challenging for people in the community who feel the same. And as a mother, that's the perspective that I bring. I think about the sort of world that I want my little girl to live in, and when she's my age and when she herself is a parent. And it's going to be a very different world, and the decisions that we take in this place today, that's what shapes that future. We have such a great responsibility, and to be having the carbon price repeal bills come to us later today in the Senate is a matter of great shame for me, and the Greens will fight that repeal with everything that we've got. We must act on climate change. It's not just for ourselves, it's for all of the other creatures that we share this planet with, and it's for all future generations to come. So we will fight for fairness, and we'll fight for climate action, we'll fight for equity, we'll fight for a better world, and I hope that we don't see this parliament taking us too far backwards in the next few years to come. But it's a challenge that the Greens are willing to face, and we pledge to all Australians that we will fight for their future.
Thank you.